Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook. Massacre at Balangiga. Hello there. We have found some stories in our hometown scrapbook that have been rich in adventure and strong in the flavor of human interest. But few, I assure you, can measure up to the story that we find tonight of two comrades in arms, the bloody massacre of Balangiga, and a meeting that occurred between two residents of Grays Harbor on a Memorial Night in February more than a quarter century ago. So when Dick Crombie has taken the customary few seconds for our sponsor, we'll open the scrapbook tonight to a story about two men who were former neighbors of ours and an adventure that took them from the island of Samar to East First Street in Aberdeen, and a meeting that some of you may remember. But first, here's Dick Crombie and a word from our sponsor. No part of the aftermath of our war with Spain presented more difficulties than the occupation of the Philippine Islands. For the natives of the island, who had pledged themselves independent with the fanatical leader Aguinaldo, were determined to fight not only against Spain, but against America to rid their island of control of any non-native people. And now, where were the natives more resound in this and more difficult to control than on the island of Samar? Samar, as you know, is the big island southwest of Luzon, separated from the island on which Manila is located by a 20-mile wide strait. In 1901, it had a population of about 100,000 people scattered through the hills and populating a host of small villages along the water. Such a village was Balangiga. For 18 months after the United States assumed control of the Philippine Islands, Samar was occupied by troops of the 43rd and 29th Volunteer Regiment of the United States Army. And for most every day of the 2-year occupation, the troops of those units fought with the unquenchable natives, to whom the sovereignty of any nation was little more than a shadow. At the end of the 2 years, when the regiments left the island, the natives were sullen and resentful, and into these two villages, where Spanish was the language of common usage, the army moved 2 of its regular regiments, the 9th and the 1st, and C Company of the 9th Infantry was assigned to the little village of Balangiga on the southern coast of the island. It was an isolated post. For 2 months after their arrival, the troops had received no mail and none had gone out. Finally, Captain Connell sent Lieutenant Bumpus to Taloban on the island of Leyte for mail, and in an open boat rowed by 4 men, the lieutenant carried out his mission. While Bumpus and his detail were away from the island, an earthquake shook Balangiga, injuring some of the natives, who were treated by Dr. Griswold, the medical man assigned to C Company. But if they appreciated the gesture, there was no evidence of it. They remained resentful, and immediately after the earthquake, they began to hold frequent meetings in the church, the only building in the village of any size of stability. When the women and children left the town, Captain Connell became suspicious of the Filipinos. But the chief of police, which acted as a go-between the relationships of the army and the natives, informed the captain that there was only a precaution against another earthquake. The explanation was accepted. It was September 28, 1901, when Lieutenant Bumpus returned with the mail for the first time in months. The men had news from home. That night, many stayed up late as usual to swap stories that had come in the mail, and one man looking out the window saw a crowd of natives gathering in the village. He notified the corporal of the guard, but an investigation revealed what was going on. The company breakfast at 6 o'clock in the morning. Their mess hall was 100 yards from their 4 small barrack buildings where their arms and ammunition were kept, but guards were posted at the doorways of the building. Suddenly, while the company was in the midst of its meal, about 100 Filipinos armed with knives and bolos and led by chief of police stormed the mess hall and the barracks simultaneously, killed the soldiers on duty, and ran over the hasty defense that the men put up with shovels and their kitchen utensils. The church bell began to ring, and other Filipinos began to appear from behind rocks and trees armed with knives to attack the soldiers. One group of Americans, led by Sergeant Bertram and Corporal Burke, rushed one of the barrack buildings to obtain arms, and fighting their way into the building with fists against the flashing of knives, they managed to gain the orderly room. There, the native police chief led a charge against them, but Burke, singing out the chief, attacked him in personal combat. The 2 men were locked in a desperate fight when Burke was thrown to the floor and fell on a revolver, dropped there by the native Filipino. With the gun, he killed the police officer chief and 4 others, and Burke and Bertram, all that had survived the detail of soldiers who had stormed the building, prepared to fight to the death. Meanwhile, one man, Sergeant George Markley, the tall West Virginian who had occupied a small barrack at the end of one of the rows, had managed to obtain arms. At the first show of violence, he rushed to the barracks and found 3 natives standing over the dead body of his guard at the entrance to the barrack. Rushing them fiercely, he leapt and felled 2 more of the Filipinos with his knees, while he clawed the 3rd one to the earth. Then over them he raced into the barracks, where he seized a rifle and killed 2 of them before they could get away. With his rifle cracked, the natives began to fall in the center of the military compound, and soldiers who had survived the first rush fought their way to the barracks for arms and joined him. Finally, with 8 men behind him, Markley fought his way to the barracks where Burke and Bertram had been taken shelter, and these 2 joined the others. They were able to save the final few of the company who had escaped the massacre. Now, with all the company officers dead, Markley and Bertram were in command, and they recaptured the store of arms and ammunition, which the natives had not known how to use, and secured their position. They had managed to save the boats moored at the water's edge, and with 22 men and 25 rifles, the survivors of Company C embarked in 2 boats for Bassie, 30 miles away. Only 5 men had come through the engagement unwounded. Albert Keller, one of the Americans, lay on the bottom of one of the boats as it pushed off from the beach, literally cut to bits. With the rest, he was given silent thanks to Sergeant George Markley, whose strength and determination had saved the little band from the death inflicted on the fellows. Before they reached haven, the boats were separated. 2 of the wounded were dead, and 2 more died soon after the boat had landed. Only 18 men of Company C had lived to tell the story of the horrible massacre. Sergeant George Markley remained in service and went on to fight in the Boxer Rebellion, but Private Al Keller had been badly wounded, so badly that Markley had assumed him among the dead. When his wounds healed, Keller's service was over, and he returned to the States to settle in a little community down along the coast of the state of Washington. While his mail was sent to Hoquiam, he lived most of the time near Pacific Beach and found work in the woods. To those who knew him, he was a man who lived on borrowed time, for he had survived the massacre. For Sergeant George Markley finished his time with the Army. He went home to West Virginia and married, and in 1910 he moved his family to the West Coast, settling near Centralia. There were a few moves after that before he finally came to Elma to make his home in 1920. Now neither man had been active in the affairs of the Spanish-American War Veterans Association, but the comradeship of men who have served together prompted them to meet the local veterans of the wars. Markley came to know many of the veterans who lived in Aberdeen, and Keller, who knew many of them who lived in Aberdeen and Hoquiam. But as the years of the 20th century began to pile up, the survivors of the never-forgotten massacre became fewer and fewer, neither that the other lived just a short journey away. It was shortly after Markley came to Elma. Several of the veterans comparing notes discovered that the two of the last survivors of the historic massacre lived in Grays Harbor. And when the veterans planned their February 4th banquet, the anniversary of Santa Ana Day, the beginning of the Philippine insurrection, they planned to bring the two men together, Dr. O.R. Austin and Dr. J.B. Ken, both veterans of the conflict, were in on what was otherwise a well-kept secret. And so came the night of February 4th, 1921. The smoke was growing blue in the dining room of the old Knights of Python Temple on Aberdeen's First Street when George Markley strode in. His big frame filled the door as he edged into the hall where the Spanish War veterans and the auxiliary were ready to sit down at the banquet tables. And the sergeant who had salvaged the remnants of Company C shook hands with all around, enjoying the group of men reliving old campaigns in the center of the hall. It was still later when Albert Keller shook the dampness of the February evening from his coat and walked into the hall to meet the veterans of the harbor on their special occasion. And by design, the plotters maneuvered the two men together. Not a word was spoken to introduce them, but suddenly George Markley saw standing before him the man who back through the years had pictured the bloody and dying victims of the Seymour Massacre, and Keller looked into the face of the middle-aged man who would forever be the broad-shouldered sergeant, the hero of the fight of the massacre. There were no words spoken, for such times there were not words needed, but before misty-eyed men who understood, Private Al Keller and Sergeant George Markley took each other by the hand and spoke the volumes of eloquent, audible things of the heart alone can say. And across half of this world, two of the last remaining survivors of the massacre were rejoined in a moment that brushed closely by history. And now, Dick Crombie, a word from our sponsor. Yes, it was the first of many meetings that were to follow for these two men who had survived one of the bloodiest massacres in military history. And from that day forward, their story was told and retold. In 1927, when the Spanish-American War veterans held their state convention in Aberdeen, the two survivors of Company C were introduced from the stage after Dart Kinney had read the historic story of the massacre on the beach at Samar, when George Markley, one of the last few to survive of the little band of 16 who escaped death at the massacre, died in 1935. Finesse was written to the part of the story that Grays Harbor was permitted to share, a story that belongs prominently in this story of your hometown and mine, our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.